So we are going to start right in. It is 11:02, and I'm super excited to, again, hold space for this community and for you to have an opportunity to hear from our incredible guest co-host. And so I want to take you through a little bit of information before I actually allow our guest co-host to greet you in his own way. And so let's go to the next slide for me, please, Natasha. And by the way, let me just share, I love the support of my team. And so I have here today supporting me from a producer standpoint, our DEI manager with Nika Consulting, and that's Natasha Poritzkova. Thank you, Natasha, for your support. I'm also being supported today by Elvia Pacheco Flores, another DEI manager, and my chief of staff, Anna Viola Goodman. So grateful to the Nika Consulting team. So I always like to let you know who's coming up next in terms of our VodCast guest co-host. And next week, I look forward to welcoming Letitia Bird. And so Letitia and I are going to talk about helping women and people of color transform their dreams into careers while making their workplaces equitable and safe spaces for all. That psychological safety is so important for us to show up at our best. And so I look forward to sharing space with Letitia next week on November 20th. You can join us from 11 to 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. And let's see what's coming up next. So following the week where we have Letitia, I get a great opportunity to welcome one of my dear friends, Tracey Newkirk. And so on December 4th, Tracey Newkirk is going to be joining, and we're going to take a close look at the role emotions and communication styles play in living a life with intention, and an eternal story that we tell ourselves. And so you're in for a treat if you join us on December 4th. Tracey is amazing. She is like an incredible guru at Strength Finders, which I have a lot of affinity to. My whole entire team, we really do use the Strength Finders assessment every single day as we interact with each other. So I look forward to having Tracey Newkirk on December 4th. Now, this brings me to the wonderful opportunity that I get to introduce our guest co-host today, none other than Dr. Tracey Benson. I want to give him a formal introduction, and then I will ask that he share with you in his own way, any way that he would like to greet you. So Dr. Tracey A. Benson is an assistant professor of educational leadership at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. His research explores the vestiges of structural racism in K-12 education that continue to impede the academic success of students of color. His book, Unconscious Bias in Schools, A Developmental Approach to Exploring Race and Racism, was released with Harvard Education Press in August of 2019. Dr. Benson has committed his career to leading for change, courageously addressing entrenched practices that impede lifetime outcomes of students of color, and coaching leaders towards implementing anti-racist and anti-bias policies and curriculum in K-12 schools. And so as I invite Dr. Benson to just greet this audience, I'm going to also ask that you take a moment to participate in our poll. And we want to know who's part of this audience. Particularly, we want to know, are you parents? Are you educators? What brings you today to this conversation in terms of the relevance of the education sector? So, Dr. Benson, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me today. Nika, I really appreciate this opportunity. It's such a great platform. I see the number of guests you've had on your show. This is a great space for folks to engage in these conversations. So I feel very blessed and honored to be invited to be on your show. And I also say thank you to everyone who's joined us today and this afternoon to sort of talk about, racism and anti-racism. It's an important conversation that we're having nationally, and we can't. There's not enough time and spaces to do these types of talks. And so I thank you again for having me, and thank everyone for showing up. And I'm really going to share this opportunity to sort of peel the onion on the different depths and layers of what it looks like in the world, what it looks like in schools, and hopefully we can engage in sort of a collective knowledge building session throughout today.
I love that. I'm looking forward to it. And so our poll results are coming in right now, Dr. Benson, and I want to share that with you. And for those who haven't had a chance to address the poll, again, if you aren't familiar with Hopin, you'll see at the top there are a couple different tabs. Polls is right in the center. If you click that, you will see it. And the results are here based upon those who have responded so far. It looks like we have 45% of educators. We have 5% students, and I understand that maybe some of the students are your students who are also educators. And then we have 10% parents, and then it's shifting by the moment, and then 32% that are none of the above, but they're curious to learn, and that's why they're here. And so, would you like to give a shout out to any of your students right now, Dr. Benson?
Yeah, hey y'all, how you doing? If you're from one of my law class or my supervision of instructor class, thank you for coming. I see you, Tamia. I see your name in the chat box, and everyone else who's come today, thank you so much for showing up for this hour.
Awesome. Fantastic. Okay. So as I mentioned before, I always like for my guest co-host to, once I've given the proper introduction and shared your accolades, your credentials, I then want people to be able to know you at a more personal level. And so please tell your story, whatever story you want to share with us. Let us know a little bit more about you that we cannot find in your bio.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a career educator. You know, I started teaching them back in 2001, and and what my students know about me, and what I started my training as a pre-kindergarten teacher, and that was my first blush with education. I was not an education major in college. I was a sociology major, but I knew I wanted to teach because both my parents were educators. My mom was a counselor, my dad was a special ed teacher. That taught in Milwaukee Public Schools my mother for her career. I think she's still doing that work in Milwaukee Public Schools, very dedicated to urban education. And so I saw it as a sort of continuing the legacy of being involved in education for the betterment of the Black and Brown community. And so I started in kindergarten. I moved on to teaching fourth grade. And then over the course of time, I had the opportunity to work in many different states and many different positions, including Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Massachusetts. And so, you know, having my career in so many different states and school districts, I had an opportunity to learn about the different ways, you know, racism and oppression works in different school districts, the differences and the similarities. And so, as I worked my way through becoming an assistant principal at the middle school level, then a high school principal at the high school level, and doing different anti-racist initiatives, you know, for the betterment of students, and seeing very positive results when you do the work well. I then decided, once I was in my doctoral program, to make this something that I would want to focus on and learn more about, because I really needed to deepen my racial literacy so then I could help others sort of get on the right path to anti-racism. And I just so happened I TF'd for my co-author, Sarah Fireman, and she invited me to join a book project on unconscious bias. And that wasn't the initial title. The initial title had more to do with what the book is about anti-racism. But we titled the book anti-racism because, I mean, titled the book unconscious bias because it's a more friendly tone, right? But it's actually a book about racism and anti-racism. So once folks pick up the book and open the first couple of pages, we sort of let the cat out of the bag that unconscious bias is a disarming term, but it's a book about anti-racism. And so we put that out into the world. It's had very great reception, and I've had a great opportunity since then through my consulting business, Tracey Benson Consulting, to partner with a lot of schools at this point from around the world, schools and school districts, to really drive forward an anti-racist agenda.
Nika, you're muted.
Oh, I thought that was just me.
Thank you. This is why I love my teammates. Thank you so much, Natasha. I appreciate that. Okay, so what I said was I appreciate the fact that you shared a little bit more of your story. And I know that you come from a family of educators. And so because of that, certainly I'm sure that's what drove your passion to want to be in this space as well. You mentioned the term racial literacy. So I would like for you to unpack that a little bit further for us.
Yeah, racial literacy is just the understanding of the dynamics of racism, how it plays out in the world, our complicity in racism, the way it works, the history of racism, where it comes from, how it permeates our society in every aspect of our society, especially in education. So once we understand the nuances of racism, the way it works out in school buildings, so for me in a position of an educator, we could then make purposeful initiatives to alleviate that oppression. Right now, what we're seeing a lot with this new wave of racial awakening across America, and especially in the education spaces, you have folks with very low levels of racial literacy. Like, what is racism? How is it perpetuated within school buildings through policies, through procedures, through practices? that are producing these disparate outcomes for Black and brown kids. And the way that we normally thought about it, and that's a normative way of thinking about it in education, it's this deficit-based perspective on these communities. They come from these communities where we imprint upon these students that they come from like single homes, they're poor students, that they're adjacent to some sort of ill, which makes them less intelligent. We don't say this is a narrative in education, but we know that we inherently believe it, right? And so we're changing that narrative to realize that it's the system that is producing these outcomes. It's not that these children show up deficient. It's the system that makes them deficient, And so by increasing our racial literacy, we understand what racism is and how it impacts on families, on communities, and also on students, so we can attack the root cause, which is racism, not the deficiency in students. So by raising our racial literacy, we're able to see the system that's producing the outcomes rather than putting it and imprinting it on students and communities.
I love that. And so, I think oftentimes the focus is on racism from a societal perspective, more from like the workplace, adults. But, we also need to be thinking about this at the school level. So I'm so glad that there are leaders like you who are providing the coaching, the education to really bring this up front and center. And so what is the current climate of racism in school?
It's always going to be an onion to peel, right? Because I think, there's all different levels of where we are as a society and where we are as an education community. I do think we've made progress, right? Because at least espoused in our laws, we no longer have legalized segregated schools where we sort of expect Black and brown schools to be, under-resourced and, Black folks to be educated over here, white folks over here, and we stay in our separate parts. We have an espoused value of integration, which hasn't been realized yet. And so we don't have an equal sort of playing field when it comes to educational opportunities between different populations and different races. We don't have that yet, but I think we're self-realized enough to realize that's one of our aspirations, And so with this sort of newer racial awakening, and sort of schools are a microcosm of the larger society, right? And so with the societal sort of American racial awakening to that racism exists, we want to be about anti-racism. There's been this recent wave of folks, again, with very low levels of racial literacy, not out of their own fault, right? Because schools actually make us functionally racially illiterate. Because you think about it, you spend kindergarten through 12th grade in our formative education, where we don't talk about race. We don't learn that race is important. We don't talk about racism. But what we do learn is that it's taboo to talk about it, that if you talk about it in the wrong ways, you get punished, that we can't talk about issues in society in terms of race in the classroom because that's not the place for it. So our schools teach us to be racially illiterate. We have to think about that because we don't get this learning within the school building. And so when we become adults, we have a hard time talking about it because we just don't have the skills. We don't have the literacy. And so so in terms of like the where we are in the school building, I think it's in schools in terms of race is that I think at least what I've been able to see in my work with people from across the country is that there's a will to sort of read a book. Let's form an affinity group. Let's have a conversation to build our literacy. And so we need to sort of make the next step to, now that we're doing all these actions, in some school districts have to develop this amazing infrastructure of actions, right? Hire a consultant, read a book, have a group. We need to then turn the corner once we reach literacy, be like, all right, now how are these actions directly connected to what's relieving the oppression on Black and brown kids? And I think that's where we are right now. We're halfway there, but we need to get to the point where we actually have proof points to say all the stuff that we've done has now made a substantive difference for Black and brown student experience.
Yeah, no, that evidence is so critical for getting people to be moved towards some type of action to help solve for those issues. And so I love that you are, again, your work is focused on that. So you talk a good bit about performative anti-racism. And I think that a lot of us, part of this community, have been involved in conversations about performative allyship in general. And so I want you to unpack performative anti-racism, because I know that there's some parallels, but it's very specific to, again, the focus on race and racism. So talk about that, Dr. Benson.
Yeah, and I wrote a piece, so you can Google it, Tracey Benson, Performative Anti-Racism, and I put it out there, and I published through Medium, because I believe that the direct voice into the field is the most powerful ways, in terms of op-eds and things of that sort. I think it's powerful because we reach a broader audience, but once I have something that's pressing and that needs to be talked about, I put it out on Medium. I have a big presence on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, because I feel that folks need the sort of weekly dose of anti-racism, because we're so
Mm-hmm.
inundated with racial bias throughout our lifetime. As the research says, that we need to be engaged in sort of purposeful anti-racism, and we need a
Yes.
weekly dose. So I'm very active. So follow me on Twitter, friend me on Facebook, hook up with me on LinkedIn, because I try to provide, I try to be the change I want to see in the world. And so
Mm-hmm.
one of the pieces is the performative anti-racism piece,
Mm-hmm.
where in terms of wanting to do something, like everyone should want to do something for anti-racism, and there's no fault in that. But we have to understand that just because we want to do something doesn't mean that everything we do will necessarily lead to relieving the oppression on Black and brown people. And
Right.
so when I talk about performative anti-racism, I'm not putting blame or shame on folks who participate in sort of the book reads and the affinity groups and hiring the consultant. But I do question um, that if your racism stops there. I mean, if your anti-racism stops there, and that's what I call performative anti-racism. If your whole idea of being anti-racist is to read a book or join a group and talk about it, and the belief that if I know better, I will do better, with no actual evidence that it relieves the
Right.
oppression of Black and brown people, you're stuck in the performative vortex. The
Yes.
performative anti-racism vortex. And school districts are so often stuck in this vortex because they believe they're doing anti-racism work. They bring in speakers. I've been one of those speakers that come in. I'm the talking brown face to talk about
Yeah.
concepts. And often they want to keep it in this intellectual space. We want to
Yeah.
intellectualize our way out of racism. And that's not the way it works. We have a socio-emotional connection to racism. It hits us emotionally, and we have to learn it adaptively, right? And change our
Yes.
mindset. And we can't keep it in the intellectual space. And so we got to move away. Like, we might start in the intellectual space, which is fine, but we have to move to the socio-emotional learning around our complicity in racism. And that's the socio-emotional part, because it triggers feelings of guilt, of shame, of sort of sympathy. But we have to get past all those emotions involved in realizing that we're perpetuating racism to a point of responsibility. And then work on specific actions that are anti-racist, that relieve the oppression on Black and brown kids.
I so love that. That is so rich, Dr. Benson. And you're right. I think that the problem with the guilting, the shaming, the blaming is that it causes people to disengage. And right now, we need everyone to be engaged in trying to dismantle systemic racism in schools and society in general, so that we all can emerge stronger. And so, to your point, I also believe that it's a both and. I think that the literacy portion, which is part of your messaging, is that sometimes that gives us the context and the awareness to then be able to hopefully be motivated to take it a step further and go deeper into our own self-awareness and education that leads us to deeper action, and not just any action, but useful, meaningful action. And so what you are sharing with this community is so rich, and I appreciate you for it. So what is the effect of white supremacy in the education system from your vantage point?
Well, white supremacy is all around us, and we have to understand when we use the term white supremacy, I'm not talking about white supremacists, right? Well, there's
Mm-hmm.
white supremacists who are sort of self-realized. We are sort of white nationalists. We believe that the whites are the best, and the Black and brown, if you're anything other than white, that you are not as good. We are inherently better.
Yeah.
So I'm not talking about the white supremacist. I'm talking about the concept of white supremacy, which
Yes.
is an arm, believing that, in the way it's always worked in this country, is that white thought and the way that whites frame issues is preeminent, that it comes from a neutral space. And if we
Yes.
think it, that must be the truth, the neutral truth. And that's white supremacy, right? And a lot of
Mm-hmm.
organizations are built on this white supremacy. And what does white supremacy tell us about racism? White supremacy tells us about racism is the way in which we enact it in the school, but it tells us that, one, it's an add-on, that we should put it in our extra time, that you can volunteer in, that it's not inherently a part of our system that we need to address. That white supremacy tells us that racism is a problem of Black and brown people. That's what white supremacy tells us. Racism is not a problem of Black and brown people. It's a problem of white people that affects Black and brown people. And we sort of get this twisted, right? Because you'll see in a lot of organizations, a lot of schools, that we want to create this diversity group, and they're like, all right, Black and brown people, come and run this diversity group, and we want you to sort of put forth the effort in sort of running the group, giving your intellectual property to the group, and really taking us along our road. And the white folks get to participate if they feel comfortable, right? And the
Right.
real work of anti-racism is among white people. Not to say it's the exclusion of people of color, But white people need to do the heavy lifting just as the people of color do. So white supremacy has really defined racism in this performative space. I think that's what the push is towards performative anti-racism, because white supremacy tells us it's just as long as you do things. And basically, if you think that you're a good person, if you think that you're a good anti-racist, and you've read Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, that naturally that will then trickle down to affect Black and brown kids some way, but we really don't have to measure it. And so we have to displace this white supremacy thought and enter in anti-racism. And anti-racism tells us that we have these problems of that exist along racial lines in school buildings, and we must attach that directly to racism as a cause, and anti-racism then to alleviate the issues with maybe overrepresentation in special education, higher rates of suspension for Black and brown kids, Black and brown kids being underrepresented in honors classes and AP classes, Black and brown kids possibly dropping out at higher rates. These are all directly, the root cause is located somewhat in the effects of racism within the school building. And we must connect it there so that we truly address the issue and alleviate these troubling trends.
No, again, this is so rich, and you use the word preeminent. So yes, we have to deprioritize whiteness and white supremacy, because if not, then what it's going to do is cause the brown and Black students to feel as though they have to conform to whiteness or either be measured against it. And that's where the danger comes in. And so I'm so glad that you're amplifying these points. So how specifically do you work with teachers and faculty and staff to help with their anti-racist lens?
So I specialize in leadership, and we have decided that being a leader who's led this work, and in the book we write I haven't led it perfectly. So it's an expose of being someone with moderate racial literacy trying to run anti-racism within a school building. So I talk about some of my successes and also some of my failures and some of the things I would have done differently. If I had the toolbox that I have now. And the reason we wrote the book is because we want principals like what I was back in the day to have something that could lead them forward. So we wrote the book that we wish we had when we were principals. And so, oh shoot, the question got away from me.
No, it's about how do you work with teachers and faculty and staff to help them to, again, address their anti-racist lens.
Right. And so, as a principal, I did several things, and my best action was to partner with an outside consultant. And I still am connected with Multicultural Bridge there in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, in Western Massachusetts, in Berkshire County. And Gwendolyn Van Sant was my coach, helped develop the work at the school because she had much higher levels of racial literacy than I did, and she knew how to do the work. And so I recommend for everyone, I know that you do work in this area. I do the work in this area. And there are a litany of folks who are experts in this area that need to be brought in to really inform how we do the work. Because like I said, in K-12, we're functionally racially illiterate. And then if we go to an undergrad, graduate school, and then off to our doctorate, we don't necessarily have to have a course in anti-racism. We don't have to know anything about racism at all in order to get a doctorate degree and then go on to be a principal or superintendent. So we're often heavily racially illiterate when we're in leadership positions. That's why we need to depend on specialists. And there are a lot of us out there to come on in, spend the time, money, and energy on us in a long-term relationship to really guide us towards building our literacy and then tooling us with the efforts to be anti-racist. And so that's how I see as a principal the best move that I did. But in my current work, I work with leaders.
Yeah.
And our philosophy is very, very simple. So how we affect teachers, how we affect students is through leadership. And our philosophy is very simple. It's be the change you wish to see in the world. Very simple. Because what folks often don't understand, we can study in terms of organizational behavior that organizations aren't changing. It's often connected to the leader. But what I try to help leaders do when they come to me, how folks end up with me, and they say, we've done all of these things. We've brought all these people in. We've had these books studied, but our outcomes for kids aren't changing. And then what it often comes down to is that the leader is expecting the organization to change, but for them to stay the same.
Right.
And this is org theory 101. Like the leader must fundamentally change their orientation to anti-racism. And by their fundamental orientation changing, the organization will change around them. But they cannot remain the same, keep themselves safe in their cocoon of safety, and expect the organization to change if they remain the same. They're essentially keeping the organization the same. And so what we do is we bring leaders in and help them get past that idea that the organization isn't changing because of other people. The organization isn't changing because of you. You are a part of the problem, and often you are the problem. And so by
Yes.
changing that mentality and that framing towards anti-racism, we help leaders over the course of 5 weeks, of course. Like we have a very intensive institute that's 5 weeks of very intense study and then 12 weeks of implementation support, because that's the way you actually produce change. You can't produce it with just one-off talk or one-off workshop.
Right.
We need to walk folks along the journey to implementing changes. So we work with leaders to then change their fundamental framing, their skill set, and their focus on anti-racism to then enact systems and processes that then they involve their, if you're a superintendent, your principals and your teachers, but if you're a principal, your teachers, and then ultimately affecting your students.
No, I love that. I love that. And what you're referring to is the Anti-Racist Leadership Institute model that you have and that you offer. Is that specific to the institute?
Correct.
Dr.
Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah. So this, as I said before, this performative anti-racism, I was one of those guys. That so I get a call, and it's very lucrative, by the way. Like you'll get a call from such institution. I want you to do 2 workshops for X amount of dollars. It's
Yeah.
very easy to do, right? And it's very
Yeah.
lucrative. But what I realized at the time that I was contributing to the problem. I was being their anti-racism. Their anti-racism was listening to me.
Yes.
And then
Yeah.
they would put up a flyer. Sometimes I'd be in a paper. I'd be on their student radio station. This is at the college level. And then once I was gone, there was actually no actualized movement. And so I've gotten away from that model. And now we're focused more in on the leader and how to truly walk someone through the process of raising their literacy, focusing on the constructive developmental lens, I mean the emotions that are connected to, realizing that you're complicit, and then developing a laser-like focused strategy to then take back into the field. And then once it gets hard, once they're back into the field, I offer what I call anti-racist executive leadership coaching for them to understand the barriers and not to then recede and go back to the comfort of white supremacy, but then to push forward with implementation.
That is so good. That is so good. I'm thinking about our client roster, and we have some clients that are in the education sector that I believe could gain a lot of value from your institute and just your teachings. And so, and probably many in this IC community as well today. So I'm looking at the poll. A new poll has been introduced, and many have already responded to it. But the question is, how confident do you feel with your ability to engage in productive conversations about racism? And we have 33% very confident, 47% somewhat confident, 17 slightly confident, and 3% not confident at all. So, and I think this is probably going to be a sample that's indicative of maybe even larger populations. The bottom line is that these conversations aren't normalized now. While it's becoming more and more of a conversation that people are willing to have, it's still quite difficult and complex, And so I love the idea of, again, the emphasis on racial literacy, because I think the more knowledgeable we are, it helps us to be more confident and at least more prepared to enter into conversations of constructs of race and racism and systemic racism. So you also mentioned a moment ago, Dr. Benson, you talked about the change process. And I was with you. I was tracking because I started thinking about, there are a lot of people who will say, yes, I don't mind change. Change is good. But then really, if you were to probe a little bit deeper, what they're saying is, I don't mind change as long as I don't have to change. Let everybody else change, right? And so it just brought up for me the significance of the importance of a change management strategy in order to help people to navigate this process. You can't just on day one say, okay, now we're going to, learn how to become anti-racist. That scares people. And so I'm just curious about the change management philosophy and how in which you may or may not introduce that directly into your work.
Yeah, again, we focus on the individual, so we do organizational theory about how organizations change or stay the same, often leads back, and most times, to the leader and their ability to change themselves as the organization changes, right? And so we focus in on that to really get folks to understand their inextricable connection to the organization. They are not outside of the organization, they're inside of the organization. And actually, when they see things clearly that are going on outside of themselves, that's a reflection back on them. That's a reflection back on me. Now, I may not be directly the cause of what's going on in the organization, but I am privy to. So if I'm passive, or if I just complain about it, if I'm not taking specific action towards changing what I see to be an issue, then I'm taking myself out of it because I think I have no control of it. We're absolving ourselves from the responsibility, and that's easy and that's comfortable, right?
Yes.
But once
Yes.
we help folks get past that discomfort of like, okay, once you decide that you're part of the organization and you are part of the problem and you are the problem, that's a different set of then you're more responsible, then you're implicated. You know, you can complain, you can still complain, you can still talk about these people over here, these barriers over there. Not saying you should stop complaining, but you have a realm of responsibility to realize the actions that you take in your position of leadership can affect these outcomes. But when you take responsibility for that, you say it's now my responsibility, rather than
Yeah.
complaining about other folks and putting the deficiency in them. You put the deficiency in your leadership, and that you need to
Yeah.
develop skills in order to get folks to change in very positive ways.
No, I love that. So part of what is, the premise of a lot of the work that we do in terms of how in which we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion is that it's a leadership function. It's a leadership competency. And so I love that you put this racism work into the context of leadership as well. And to go along with what you were just sharing, Dr. Benson, I think the value of that is it gets people to realize that as a leader, not necessarily by position or title, although that's part of it as well, but just by influence. And we can lead from any place within an organization if we think about it as influence. Well, what that does is it leads those individuals to begin to own it and be accountable for it, and to stop being passive and seeing it as the responsibility of someone else to solve for that. And so I love that you talk about it as a leadership function, because that is the premise of the work that we do at Nika Consulting. And so great alignment there.
That's awesome. That's great. And I mean, I think that's the secret sauce that goes across any sort of organizational
Yeah,
change. These
right.
organizational concepts that we learn, or leadership competencies, you can apply them to anti-racism. And that's
Yeah,
our jobs, is to bring, and I use a number of leadership competencies along with constructive developmentalism that's not based in anti-racism, but I've translated that to help folks understand that these competencies go along a wide spectrum, but they also apply to anti-racism.
and guess what? There's a growth capability to it, right? No one is born racist and no one is born anti-racist, right? It's more about what you do, not who you are. And I think that when we think about it from a leadership perspective, and we know that there are ways in which we can build our equity and inclusion muscles to be able to support people so they can show up at their best because they feel a sense of acceptance and belonging, I think that equates to, again, just this knowledge of, am I owning this? Do I see this as something that's part of my responsibility to help create those experiences for others? And so I love it. I love the leadership talk. And I
wanted to pin something that you just said that's very important. That sort of like you dropped the gem, but that's very important. I want to pause on for a minute. Like, we have to build our equity muscle. Right?
Yeah.
And that's something you just sort of got, but folks understand that when you build a muscle, it is uncomfortable. When you've never run a marathon before and you're training for a marathon, it is uncomfortable. But you have to go through the discomfort and realizing there's a positive outcome from experiencing that discomfort. So marathoners, even though they might be the most highly trained marathoner, it's still uncomfortable to run. But they've developed a comfort with discomfort so that they're able to progress. And so when you talk about building our muscle, when we have the discomfort that enters into ourselves, into the room of people around doing anti-racism, that is positive, that this exists in a space of discomfort. And the more we build our muscle for becoming accustomed to discomfort, the better we're going to be at sort of navigating and realizing that it's a positive thing. We need to celebrate the discomfort. And then at the end of training for this marathon in anti-racism, that we'll become more comfortable with discomfort, which will make us better anti-racist.
I so am with you, Dr. Benson. This is so good. I often say we have to choose courage over comfort, because this work can be very uncomfortable. We're going through a change process oftentimes. But again, the beauty of it is that it has a growth capability to it, which means that we can continue to get better if we're committed to getting better. First and foremost, we have to just make sure we have that commitment. And I equate it oftentimes to other like soft skills. We don't necessarily always just know how to manage people or to communicate effectively or to resolve conflict effectively, but there are tools to help us to be equipped to get better in those areas. And I think that we need to see the leadership of, anti-racism and equity and inclusion and belonging in that same fashion. So I want to acknowledge that we have lots of great discussion that's going on into the chat, and I see your questions and I appreciate them, and we're going to shift to them in just a second, so keep them coming. I also want to acknowledge our live Facebook audience. I always like to make sure that I shout them out. Appreciate you being here with us as well. Use the comments box, because that information is being tracked and we will bring it into our hop-in community here. So my next question is related to good non-racists versus bad racists. And there's a misconception about that binary. And I know that in the prep calls, you talked a little bit about this. So I want our audience to be able to have value into hearing about it. So can you unpack that for us and elaborate on your personal experience? A good non-racist versus a bad racist?
Yeah, this is a captive construct that, we often fall into, and we see that now sort of play out on a national scale, right?
Right.
For, you have the left who are like the good non-racists, and then those on the right who are the bad racists. We have these polars in which we can point to the racists over there, which means that I'm not necessarily racist, right?
Yeah.
Which is a fallacy, which is a binary. So Robert DiAngelo writes about this in a book on white fragility, is this construct of either you're a good non-racist or a bad racist. If you're a good non-racist, you're liberal, you're open-minded, you're considerate, and most of all, you're not racist. But if you're a bad racist, that you're, ill-intentioned, you're conservative, you're racist, you have all these bad characteristics, and either you're this or you're that. I talk about this in the TED Talk, and I unintentionally made it sound like I know Robert DiAngelo. I want to clear that up. We are not people. I read her work and I use it in the book, but I do not know her personally. But this construct puts us in a space where we have these polars, and we really stop learning. Because what happens when we come into multiracial spaces to talk about the concept of racism, folks who are caught in this binary of this and seeing themselves as good non-racists are shelled off because they don't want to let their racism show. We don't want to say the wrong thing. We don't want to do the wrong thing. They're so afraid that they're gonna say the wrong thing, and then instantly they're gonna put them in the bucket of the bad racist. So people are shelled off, and they're not as open as like, I really want to explore racism because I really don't have really high racial literacy, but I'm so scared of saying something racist and then being the bad racist that I can't learn. That's one. So it's the internal struggle with folks who are caught in this binary, but it's also an external struggle, right? For those who see themselves as good non-racists, they then look at folks who are racist and think, oh, I either need to write you off, drop you as a Facebook friend, or you can't be in my friend circle anymore because you're the bad racist over there. I'm not like you, so I have to distance myself from you. Which of course then you don't learn. You don't have a dialogue because you're the bad racist over there. Right? And so it inhibits learning all around. What we have to understand that there is no binary, that there's a racial identity development continuum. Okay? And this is something that I forget her name, but you can type in racial identity development continuum, a white racial identity development, and I'll remember her name later. But basically, folks are all along the continuum of racism. We've all internalized some sort of racial bias because that's the society in which we live. Even folks with brown skin living in a society that's built on a foundation of racism have ingested racial biases. They exist in there. And we're somewhere along that continuum in terms of our racial identity development. And if we look at if we think we're progressed to a certain point on the continuum, we can't then look back and say, oh, you are a bad racist. No, you're just really early on in your learning. So you might not understand that by wearing the Confederate flag, that's really offensive because of its attachment to a very ugly history in America, right? And so you don't have yet the literacy yet to really understand what that means for Black and brown people and what that means to America about this particular symbol. So you might wear it and be proud of it, and you don't have the racial literacy yet to really understand why that might be offensive to some people. But if these folks who are considered themselves the good racists are like, no, I'm not going to have this conversation, they can never progress in their racial literacy. So we have to see everyone along a continuum, that we're all learning together. And the more that we do that, the more we can get folks out of these boxes, and we can have these conversations, not just reducing them down to the least desirable characteristics, like you are a racist. And if you're a racist, that's the only thing you are. That's one of many characteristics of someone that has ingested racism, but they have a lot more positive characteristics that we can identify with, that we can draw ourselves to, and hopefully have a conversation about race so we can both learn from each other.
I love it. I love it. So let's go to some of the questions now, because there are many from our audience today, and we really appreciate the engagement. So this one is from Tina Louise. Her question is, do you feel or believe that your anti-racism should be implemented in elementary schools now, so that students can understand and learn before middle school? So is there a certain time period that you feel like the teachings needs to be implemented?
So there was a study by Kenneth and Mamie Clark conducted back in the 50s. I'm sure most people have heard about this. It's the doll study. Have you heard of it? I mean, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So for those who don't understand, the doll study was the husband and wife Black psychologists, and they performed the study. And it's been replicated a number of times since then with the same result. And what they did is took a group of Black children, a group of white children who were 5 years old, and presented them with a group of dolls, right? Half the dolls were Black, half the dolls were white. and they asked the child to pick the doll they wanted to play with, right? And regardless of the color of the child, regardless of what race or color the child was, they more often than not chose the white doll, right? Because they've ingested the standard of beauty, standard of what's friendly. And then when they were asked about why they chose the white doll, the children would say, regardless of they're white or black, that the doll looks nice, the doll looks pretty. And then asked why they didn't choose the black doll, they say, oh, it looks ugly and looks unfriendly. So if children who are 5 years old have already ingested this racial bias that they've learned throughout society, maybe in their family structure, throughout their, on television, in the grocery store. So these racial biased images and messaging are coming to us all the time. If they've learned it by 5, I believe that anti-racism needs to start at 5, right? Because they've already ingested it. Now that comes with a couple of different layers though, because we have to make sure that the teachers who are supposedly addressing these issues of anti-racism are competent themselves. Because teachers can actually do more harm than good if they're racially illiterate and thinking that just having these conversations in a way that they know what's best, and they think they're in and they know about how to do it, they do it in a way that's harmful, they actually do more harm than good. So I think teachers need to be understand their role in anti-racism and talking about color and talking about race in a way that doesn't cause more damage than good.
Right. Yeah. So that the study that you brought up, very familiar with it. Probably many in the audience are familiar with it as well. But now I'm going to be vulnerable, share a truth. So my mom loves to tell the story about when I was a little girl. I don't know, maybe 4 or 5. How for Christmas I got a black baby doll, and I cried. I cried because I wanted the white baby doll. And so I share this truth to say it is real. Kids are impressionable. So what we are exposing them to in terms of right, wrong, good, or bad, those perceptions, it's deep. It's deep and it stays with them. And so, yeah, I agree with you. I think that we need to start as early as possible. So going to this next question from Liz. Her question is, how do we start that conversation with people that are not Black or brown? What are some starter conversations? I recently tried to bring this via another activity, and the non-brown and non-Black people wouldn't engage. So how do we start the conversation with people that are not Black or brown? Oh, I think we lost Tracey. Okay, so I'm sure Natasha's probably on the phone now, getting him back on, but it looks like we lost Tracey. Let me see about some other questions in here that's in the chat, and thank you all for engaging. So let's see, can we think of translating common experiences of anti-racist education in the US and Latin America? And Tracey is back. Dr. Benson, can you hear us?
Oh no, can you hear me? I can't hear you at all. You can hear me?
I can hear you. You can't hear me? Maybe try to go back out and come right back in again.
I am so sorry.
No, you're fine. It happens. Testing. Can you hear? So Dr. Benson, try exiting out completely and then coming back in. Can you do that? I'm going to put it in chat, so maybe he'll see that. Okay, so we'll give it just a second, and hopefully Dr. Benson can rejoin us. We were just getting to some really good questions from the from this community. So thank you all for your questions, your engagement. Can you hear us, Dr. Benson?
Oh no.
Can you hear us?
You can hear me though. I can't hear anything. Okay.
Okay, let me see if he can take a, Natasha, if you could put a chat in there. Yes, I see you're already on it. Testing. He took his headphones out. Can you refresh? Sounds like he may have a bad connection. So by the way, so those of you who are in the chat, we have a backstage chat. And so my team and I are trying to communicate with Dr. Benson that way, knowing that he can't hear us. Okay, they're getting him on the phone. So we're seeing this unfold and be resolved real time. Testing, can you hear us now? Okay, we lost him again. I think he's trying to call me now, which means I can bring him in by audio. And if this doesn't work, we'll have to just make sure we bring him back, because he is absolutely amazing. And I know that I have enjoyed being a student over these past 45 minutes. Do we have you, Dr. Benson? No. Okay. Okay, it's fine. So here's what we're going to do. We're just going to end it a little bit early, unfortunately. And so if you all can just make sure you stay closely connected, we will be sure that we let you know at a new date that we can bring Dr. Benson back, because I don't believe you still can't hear me, right, Dr. Benson?
I can hear you through the phone right now.
Oh, okay. Well, great. Well, we can hear you, so that works. Okay, so we have about a good 12 or so minutes left, and we do have a number of questions. So I wanted to see if we can take some more of the audience questions. And so we'll attempt to do it this way, as long as that works for you. So let me get back to our questions.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. This is perfect.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. So yeah, we have kudos to my team for problem solving. Okay, so here's a question. Can you tell us about your favorite experience doing research in schools?
Also, I did a recent study on the differential student-teacher matching, and what that means is that we looked for the ways in which teachers are assigned to students over time in a school district from 4th grade to 8th grade. And I noticed this was a pattern when I was a high school principal. Is why we changed the configuration of our teachers, because what we noticed is that the least experienced teachers were teaching the lowest level courses over the course of time. So we're producing a 2-track system of education. So if you had honors and AP courses through the course of high school, you would have highly experienced teachers. But if you took standard courses, you'd have novice teachers for your entire time in high school. So we changed this practice at the high school I was at. And so I continued this with a research study in a local school district around the same pattern in middle school. And so we just measured this according to race over time in terms of the matching of teachers, certain students by race with teacher, over the course of 4 years. And what we found, especially in the area of math, that if you're a Black or Latino student, you consistently got a less experienced teacher over the course of 4 years than if you were a white student. So it's an innocuous pattern, but it's something that cannot be explained away by chance. So they were inadvertently producing the achievement gap by giving Black and brown students less experienced teachers over the course of 4 years, and giving the white students teachers that were more experienced, in a supposedly racially heterogeneous school, in a school that was integrated. And so we did that study. We gave the data to the district, and now they've worked on breaking that pattern, because that's something that's just been established. So that's been my favorite research study.
No, I love that. That's great. It'll be interesting to kind of follow that study as well. So we'll have to make sure you keep us posted. So this next question comes from Trisha, and you talked a bit earlier today, Dr. Benson, about the difference between white supremacy versus white supremist. And so her question is, how can white people accept the concept of white supremacy and differentiate it from white supremacist?
Well, it comes with education, that there has to be a will and a want to differentiate the two, right? It comes with knowledge, it comes with racial literacy, right? So the depths of white supremacy is built into our history of the country. Whites as the dominant race for pretty much into perpetuity. It's not like that has really changed, right? But we need to understand the particular concept. So there are articles, there's books, there's films about the concepts of white supremacy, and we need folks to get past the discomfort of using the word white supremacy to recognize that we're talking about a construct. We're not talking about a people. Just because you're white, you're not a white supremacist.
However, you are complicit in white supremacy if you unintentionally, or if you're deliberately indifferent to learning about white supremacy. That makes you, complicit because you're deliberately indifferent. So I can't get folks to accept it. What we could do is expose folks to the concept in very real ways and try to get them to understand that. But it's often best when it's connected to a specific outcome, right? If we just keep folks in this space of discomfort to having these conversations about white supremacy, folks they only have so much stamina for discomfort unless it leads to some outcome. And so we have the best way to do it is have these concepts and conversations and book reads and sort of workshops all around us, driving us towards a specific outcome that we can see and we can celebrate. And I think that's how you get folks to really attach to the idea of anti-racism and of anti-white supremacy.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because what I'm finding also is that as the conversation is shifting, when people are calling in behaviors that are considered racist, it creates this tension whereby the person automatically feels as though they're being called a racist. And so it becomes less about the act and the behavior and more about the person. And I think that that's to the detriment of our ability to help people see that it's not the way in which we've talked about it from historical reference. It looks different. Now it can show up very subtly, but it's still very toxic and dangerous. And so we have to call in those behaviors. So I appreciate that. So here's a question from Kyra. Is the only way to make a meaningful shift towards anti-racism in education is to ensure that the student body is diverse from kindergarten level onwards? How do we do this? I think changing the English curriculum and including fiction told by non-white voices is an important step because it helps bring the conversation into the social, emotional field as opposed to intellectual. Your thoughts in response to that?
Well, I think it's multi-layered. We have to do things within our circle of influence. It's laudable to think about like the broader construct of racism, right? And so we get this in our institute, and we also get this when I work with people one-on-one, understanding the depth of racism. Once folks increase their racial literacy, they often get overwhelmed. Like, oh my gosh. And they develop anti-racism phobia because they're like, if we can't do everything, they become paralyzed, because I can't do everything. Racism's too big. What is my role? The role of each individual person is to do your anti-racism within your circle of influence.
Right.
So if you're an English teacher where you feel like there's underrepresentation of Black and brown authors within your curriculum, you should introduce that because that's your anti-racism. But you also have to know that how you have to change your pedagogy. It's not just having representation of Black faces. You have to understand how that essentially changes the pedagogy, which was previously white supremacy, but now you're entering in more diverse voices. But how do we use that as a juxtaposition to sort of fight against the white supremacy that's in the rest of our curriculum? And so. And then also this sense of multiculturalism, that in order to be anti-racist, you must have a multicultural setting. We're talking about the concept of racism. Racism lives in places without Black and brown people. It's a concept. It's an ideology.
Yeah.
And so, and it then results in kids who like graduate from school, they then carry it into society and then perpetuate that. So we don't necessarily need any representation of any configuration of Black and brown kids or white people. That in every configuration, the concept of racism exists. And so we're more interested in understanding, and I propose that children of any color will benefit from understanding the concept of racism so that we can attack that as a concept and as a construct for the society so everyone can be involved in anti-racism.
No, that's rich. So this next question is from Rachel. Is there a way to make this training compulsory for school boards and also for private schools? So much racism goes on, especially in private schools, and minorities just accept it as a norm. How can this training be made mandatory?
Again, like if folks are truly interested in this as a goal, again, we need to take it from an idea to how do we translate that into a responsibility, right? And so I've worked with several independent schools, several private schools, but what it took was like a very invested group of parents to say, my child experiences intense racism in the school building. They took it upon themselves to seek me out, to bring me in, to meet with the leadership and the sort of the front office about what anti-racism should look like. And so these group of Black and Latino parents decided that it was then their responsibility to take care of for their child. And they brought me in for then the administration to make it mandatory, because that was their demand. And so they chose to take it within their circle of influence. What can I do? And so the idea of, should these trainings be mandatory? Yes. Should we teach anti-racism teach how to talk about race and racism in K-12? Yes. Should every teacher and superintendent and principal who goes through a higher education program having to learn that be a required competency? Yes. And we also have to think about what is our circle of influence and what can we influence? While we have these great goals and laudable goals out there for other people to do, what can we do in our roles?
Are you seeing a difference, Dr. Benson, in private schools versus public schools in terms of the appetite for this type of training and coaching and leadership? Or it's a pretty...
So I don't have a ton of experience in private school. So
Okay.
I've only worked with maybe 3 and I work with one international school too right now. So I don't have a ton of experience, but what I do know is that the ones in which I've had the most traction is from the impotence of invested parents who push and will not take no for an answer.
Yeah.
And so, when you have folk, when it affects your bottom line, because these schools are profit-based, right? And when it affects your bottom line and you have parents out there that are speaking poorly about your school and your school building, that creates a threat. And so I think the appetite comes when there's a threat that to your name, to your brand. And so I think the appetite comes from there. But in terms of like the overall understanding of the importance of anti-racist education, I'm not quite sure it's as much of an impetus in private schools, especially private schools that are, financially solvent and that, don't have a lot of Black and brown kids. So I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So I want to go back in fairness to Liz's question. And we started to address this question early on before we were having some audio challenges. But her question is, how do we start the conversation with people that are not Black or brown? What are some starter conversations? She mentions that she recently tried to bring this to non-brown and non-Black people, and they wouldn't engage. And so do you have some strategies or best practices for really just broaching this conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so when we talk about the 2 concepts of learning, increasing your racial literacy, and then going out and implementing anti-racism. So increasing your racial literacy, you're learning to read. Basically, you're learning how to interpret racism in society, what it looks like, how it plays out. Now, the next part is reading to learn. So we actually have to go out and implement it. And if we try one tactic and it doesn't work, we can't just stop.
Right.
Like we just learned to read. So then you have to read to learn. So you're going to get it wrong a lot. It's not going to work. People are going to get upset. People are going to disengage. But you can't use that as say, okay, now it doesn't work because I have one track. That this is your first time really taking this as your responsibility. And so you have to try and try and try until you learn how to do it in a way that reaches people. They engage in a way in which is productive. So myself as a consultant, my consultant, the function of our product has changed rapidly over 10 years, ruggedly over 10 years.
Right.
Because I was still reading to learn. I was reading the field and seeing what needed to be effective. And so in the one-on-one interpersonal communications or communication with the group, if it's not working with one tactic, you got to go back, retool, not give up, and come back again and try a different way until you learn how to do it in a way in which folks.
Yeah, you don't give up. You keep trying. Many want to fix it and move on. And, there's no such thing as the Staples easy button in this work, right? We have to just keep doing it, trying different things. And so we are so close to the top of the hour, and I want to give you an opportunity just to share if there's anything else that we have not talked about today that you feel emboldened and empowered around, lots of energy and passion for, that you want to introduce to this community. I want to give you a chance to do that.
Well, thank you so much. And I appreciate everyone for coming today and engaging in the chat and being patient through the audio issues. I do apologize. I don't know what happened, but I appreciate you for sticking on. And what I do want to put out there is that for those of us who are attending here today, whose schools or organizations are engaged in this anti-racist journey, and we understand that we're getting stuck in neutral, meaning that we're doing a bunch of actions without any connection to sort of alleviating the oppression of Black and brown people, the realization that you're caught in this sort of anti-racist performed anti-racist vortex is a part of, so the realization might not be moving. And our role then is to ask the question, what's in it for Black and brown students? And stick on that. What's in it for Black and brown students? And if we don't have the answer to that from these actions, you're not doing the work. And then if folks don't know where to go from there, send them to the Anti-Racist Leadership Institute. Come on, we work with a lot of people. We work with a lot of leaders. Come on in, you'll be better for it.
That is awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Benson. This has been an hour so rich of so many good information, so much good information that you've been able to share with this community. So we just appreciate you. I always say that when people accept our invite, it causes me and my team to feel seen, valued, and heard. And so I just appreciate you taking the time to be with us. And I also want to thank our audience. I want to thank each of you for accommodating your schedules to join us for the Intentional Conversations podcast. We hope that you have found this information to be useful. This afternoon, you can anticipate a follow-up email that will have a link to the recording so that you can replay it and share it out with others. It'll also have some key takeaways and the link for you to register for next week Intentional Conversations podcast. And so we look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great weekend. Thank you all so very much. And by the way, shout out to all the teachers and all the teachers that are parents trying to teach other parents' kids and their own at the same time. We talked about that early on, and wow, my hat goes off to you. So have a great weekend. Bye-bye.